The next panel, everybody knows Dele. They met him yesterday and the day before and the day before. Very excited about having Dele back with us today here. And we have Michael Casey, rock star, journalist, creator of companies, seller of companies, all around smart guy, interesting. And they're going to be talking on a fireside chat, talking about the economy of self-sovereign identity. Those are two simple sentences, but there's a lot to unpack in that. So let's see where this conversation goes. Some of you may have heard at dinner, if you were not was it yesterday? The day before. The day before when we had dinner, Dele is going to announced something that was a pre-announcement at dinner about metaKnights and the very limited, beautiful link-to-Knights NFT that he created for us. So we'll show that a little bit. So come on up, guys. Round of applause. Let's give them some encouragement. We've all had lunch. We've all had wine. We're going to take this out of the way.
Awesome. All right. Grand. Okay. I feel like it was an odyssey to get here for this today. I was in London for a couple of days, had to get up at 5 this morning to get my 7:30 flight, but I wasn't prepared for a 3-hour wait getting through Lisbon immigration, which gave me a lot of time to think, actually. Right. You're standing in a line and you're just like, what does this mean? What does all this mean? Right. It occurred to me as I was going through the process, this is completely relevant to the conversation that you and I are going to have. Because the reason that I was, and also it seems British citizens, but Brazilians and a bunch of other people were in this massive line, and all of the EU citizens, but not just the EU citizens, the Australian citizens, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, right, the Turkish, I think, as well, just breezing through electronic passports straight through, boom, 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 like in a matter of almost seconds. And the rest of us in, I tell you, the most interminable line of immigration I've ever seen. Why? I was thinking about it. It goes back to a decision that was made by some Americans. In fact, the very earliest Americans, in terms of the American nation, the founding fathers, who created a decentralized system. The U.S. Constitution is one of the great decentralized systems of the world. There's a balance of power, right, between the states. And because of that balance of power, as well as I think some great libertarian traditions and things, and a resistance to the idea of centralized information that comes specifically around COVID and the vax systems, the United States produces a little paper certificate, the CDC's vax card. And in the EU, they have a centralized database that every country accedes to, and not only EU countries, but other countries have signed on to that standard. And the payoff for doing so is rapid through immigration, right? The cost is something we don't know, right? It is about data and control of the self. It's really what it's about. And the reason I was thinking, okay, so this is one of the great challenges of what we're talking about here. Right? Dele is foremost expert when it comes to thinking about data, personal data, how we protect it, what it means to be in the digital age with all these problems associated. We hear all about the hacks and like the challenges we face in this. But the core problem is this trade-off, the convenience, right, that comes with these centralized systems. That manage them very efficiently. Centralization is really efficient. But I once heard an economist say that if you took an engineer, a software engineer, and they're always inclined towards centralization because it's just the easiest, fastest thing. If you just left them completely to their own, they would rebuild the Soviet Union. Right? Soviet Union's a very efficient way of command control. Absolutely. So there's the convenience and the efficiency, but we give up a lot in terms of our data privacy and everything else. So this trade-off is really the battle of our time in many respects. So anyway, I thought it was actually totally a relevant experience, but why don't you start with what do you mean by the economy of self? Because the economy of self, in some respects, is about trade-offs. It's about choices and resources. Where do we put our resources? So give us your explanation for what this concept means.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. I think the way I think of the economy of self is that it's not a surprise we've been in the sharing economy. That's essentially the promise of Web 2.0 and the world has become. And that sharing has led to great conveniences. If you think about Uber as an app, it's magical, really. If you kind of went back 15 years ago, and the first time I really appreciated the value of it, I was in Indonesia, and the only way I could get a car to get to the office was to hire a car for the day. And I figured, well, let me try this Uber thing and see if it works out here. And literally, I put in the address, and I was taken to the office instantly and taken back. The other side of the world where I was not known, I didn't know anything. So that's truly magical convenience, right? So that's the promise what the sharing economy has brought. But the promise of Web3 is about the ownership economy. And it's really how do we move? Because we now start to see that, as you well point out, there are dangers that come from ubiquitously sharing all of this information. We no longer own anything. I mean, I get really frustrated with music, with the whole streaming services, because I don't own my music anymore. There used to be a time when your parents would buy albums and you could pass them on to someone else, but you can't pass on your Spotify subscription to your nephew or to your kids when you go. We're talking about our estates when we leave and all of these things. So it's like our life is all on lease at the moment, and that's really perilous. And if we're really talking about intergenerational wealth and wealth building, which is what we're really all interested in here as an investor community, well, if you don't own your assets, if everything is on lease, then there is no intergenerational wealth. The owners of the platforms are accumulating mass amounts of wealth, but we, the users of those platforms, don't have any. So this is what Web3 is really seeking to disrupt. But ultimately, when you look at that context, I think two things are really important. The first is that the data is the economy. McKinsey did a study, I think back in 2016. There's more GDP generated around the world for moving data than there is for moving physical goods. So data is the economy. It is the driver. It is the oil of the 21st century in that regards. So that's a really important context. And in that context, they say every 2 years we generate more data than has ever been generated in history. That happens from us. It's not enterprise data, it's consumer data. It's videos and dances and motion, and that's where all of this data really comes from. So when you start to think about this data economy, we are the generators of it. And so the principle of the economy of self is that as we move to this economy of ownership, that we get to own our contribution to that economy. And I know when we say data, that's very abstract, but where I'm very interested in going further, and I know you've got a lot of, you're a master in this space in many regards, is media. When you start to think about personal data as personal media, and then personal IP, then you start to get a sense of what we're talking about in a more pragmatic sense. So that's essentially the vision of the economy itself.
Okay, great. Absolutely perfect, succinct building block for this conversation. So let's just focus on the word self, right? There's a really good book that I would thoroughly recommend a lot of you read by Shoshana Zuboff. You've heard me say this plenty of times, I always rave about it. Because it was a book that really just made me realize that, oh my God, we are already living in the matrix. She wrote a book called Surveillance Capitalism. It breaks down the essence of what has happened with the emergence of Google, Facebook, Amazon, these mammoth platforms, to Dele's point, who own everything, and we are essentially leasing access from. So they have the power to shut us off. But more importantly, they track everything that we do, and they use that information against us. Or, we're literally, we're part of their market, but they can manipulate us through this. And so she talks about this to be a challenge to the very principles of liberalism, the idea of the self, humanity, who I am, freedom, right? That this is a core challenge, and we need to get that back. So the idea of the self is this the Western idea of the self is that I have sovereignty, I have power over the self, right? So that to me is a core element. But I think it's also important to recognize that the self is only definitional relative to the collective, right? Like there's no self on your own. You are a self relative to everybody else. There are two sides of the same coin, right? So what I have found really compelling about the crypto and blockchain world, and I think, to be honest, a lot of really hardcore Bitcoin maximalists and libertarians, I think actually get it wrong. Like they think of it this thing that I need to it's all about me and hanging onto my assets and no one's going to touch it. But the power of blockchain is actually the fact that you can have that ownership, but be able to transact it. I can get gold and lock gold up in my backyard, but it's not easy to transact.
Yes.
The power of it is the transactability, which is indeed the ability to actually then engage with that collective. So it's this dichotomy between the self and the collective that I think is really important. But that being the case, where does it go? Like, once we get this, if we can get this ownership, this power, and we're going to talk about how we get there to start with, I suppose. But if we can, how do we then transform the actual economy, the collective economy, through that interactivity?
Oh, okay, that's a lot. Absolutely right, and there's a lot of ground to cover in there. So let's try and make it succinct. So 100%, I think self is a really important concept, and you're absolutely right, the relationship between the individual and the community. This is essentially the essence of what all rights are about. You know, the community the state represents the community, the collective. And it's all about balancing the rights between the collective and the individual. And that in Western societies is what we celebrate, the rights of the individual, but only to the extent that they don't impact the rights of the collective. So it's a very fundamentally important thing to get right. And the democratic principle is that we all as individuals have a stake in determining the rights of the community to impose rights on us as individuals. So when you talk about the ability of big others, as Jana calls it, in surveillance capitalism, to influence us, to persuade us, to manipulate us, to curtail our rights, you know, you start to understand the extent of the power of the importance of this. And, you know, and you're absolutely right as well. It is about interaction. You know, when I think about digital rights, and that's always been our North Star as an organization, digital human rights. Summarize it down to three very simple principles about privacy, property, and agency. And, you know, agency is essentially freedom, property is property, and privacy is about control. And I think this is the really important point when we start to come to self. There's a lot of mischief done around identity. And, you know, people always talk about, oh, we need to protect identity or give people identity. I think the two most misunderstood things in the digital realm are identity and data. You know, identity is, to your point, you know, if you live on a desert island, you don't really need an identity, do you, right? Because you're interacting with others that you need an identity. But even more importantly, in the digital world and the big surveillance industrial complex, here's the real trick. And this is a really important, subtle point, but one that you'll understand when people talk about they provide you with privacy in the space, you'll understand. Everyone talks about personally identifiable information and how we don't collect personally identifiable information, so we protect your privacy. But the reality is, Big Other doesn't care about who you are. It's not about who you are. It's not about your name. You're a number as far as Big Other is concerned. It's about what you are and what you do. So it's really about the ability to identify you as an individual. That is the thing that puts you most at risk, not what your name is. That's kind of last order, and most of the time they don't really need to know that. But it's the ability to see you as an individual from a group and to be able to track and trace you. So that starts to give you a sense of what your self is in a digital context. It's this individuality. And it turns out that every interaction we have with the digital verse, whatever you want to call it, metaverse or internet or whatever, Web3, whatever you call it, forms a unique signature. So really, the real trick about how we give protections in the space is by giving you control around your identifiability as an individual. You know, that's what it ultimately comes down to. How do you protect yourself from being individualized? You know, that's actually more important than identified in that regards. And
that behavior then, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so to bring back to the point about the economy now, it turns out that if you can protect that component, then you start to bring value to your data as property.
Right.
So that's how
an agency then,
an
right?
agency, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Which you know then blows up the model, right? Because the model for the Web 2.0 world, you know, where these platforms, you know, you probably heard the famous saying that, you know, you are not Facebook's customer, you are Facebook's product, right? So that model is essentially that you know, you're going to feed me all of your data, and then I'm going to take that from you and turn that into some product, and I'm going to sell that to advertisers or to, but I'm going to be kind of brokering against you. Like you think about what Amazon does. Amazon will open this platform and says everybody can come and trade on it. But you know what? If Amazon starts selling something that it knows all the data. It knows where the market is. So is it going to give you, if you're a competitor with Amazon, the same access to the same data? And how would you even know? Because they control the algorithms, right? So, but if you build a model where everybody has agency, it looks like a very different economy, a very different digital economy than the one we have now. So I mean, well, first of all, let's that I don't want to get to that, but I'm going to go backwards again. I'm going to say, like, you know, you said, okay, we need to figure out how to control our data so that we are not individualized by the platforms. How do we do that?
I mean, so it's complex, and I don't want to get too deep down in the weeds on technical terms in that sense. So let's kind of bring it to a realm that I think is more digestible in this sense. What it ultimately comes down to is we've got to stop thinking about data as these fluids, as these flows, as these oceans, these pools. And I like to use the analogy like light physics. Is light a wave or is it a particle? And we kind of need to have this particle approach to data, like we call it quantum data. But that's as complex as I'm going to go with it today. But what I think is a good analogy or a good reference point for that is like NFTs. So when you think about an NFT, you're able to quantify, you're able to make this unit of digital content, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter what the NFT gives you rights to, but you're able to identify now that you've got this individual component of something that you now have rights to. And it's really fascinating because there's a real secret in this. And I was talking with a friend this morning on the way over here about brands getting involved with NFTs and how, you know, and I think someone else gave the example about Breitling. When you buy a watch, they'll give you an NFT and then they can deploy insurance or sell you insurance either at point of purchase or afterwards. So what is really interesting when you think about an NFT in that context is that you are actually now putting the relationship between if you're a business, you're putting the relationship between yourself and a consumer into an object, not into a platform, not into a network. So what starts to become really interesting is that this NFT now starts to become this vehicle for you to have relationships. And then when you think about NFTs and value in that sense, what you start to then see is it's the community of people who have access to this that starts to become the platform. So it's a complete transformation. This is, for me, what Web3 really represents. This breaking down of the barriers of platforms where we can have these direct relationships with ourselves and valuable assets, you know, and those assets can express them. They can be used to express every kind of access, every kind of content flow that you can imagine, but it's not confined by a platform. The network gives us all the capabilities, kind of like the vision of what the internet originally was.
Yeah, it is. I mean, they talk about the missing link within the internet was the failure to create a value exchange system. The definition of value as a digital form So money was the classic example of that, but it really, as it turns out, was property itself, right? So that we just had this amorphous digital realm, and nobody could define separate assets. So as a result, everything just sort of gravitated towards the biggest controlling entities, and they put lawyers around them. And if you used the asset, which really wasn't an asset, was the rights to the IP that was contained and represented in the asset, you'd be sued, right? But if you're not big enough to sue, then you get copyright. You know, so as a result, you know, the platforms, Facebook was built. I think the core aspect of what Facebook and Twitter and these things did was to have a blanket T&C structure that says when you put up a photo or an image, you know, or tweet, whatever it is on this platform, you sign away your copyright, right? Because then we could all just come together and we wouldn't have to worry about the litigious part of it. It's just that's not the game anymore. The game is building followers and everything else, but all around their terms, right? So that was the solution to the absence of the capacity to identify digital assets. The fact that we can do that now is a massive breakthrough. It changes everything. Because property rights, which is really where we're going. I mean, I don't know that we're there yet. I think that I like to think of NFTs as kind of like digital serial numbers, right? But the concept of a property right has all these legal components to it. We've got to figure out what we know there is a certain amount of control because you control the private keys that can impact what's going to happen to that asset. But have we defined it as ownership yet? I don't know. But I do think it's the building block for this concept of property rights. If you go back through history and look at all these moments when property rights were assigned to different classes of people around different assets, many occasions there's huge economic booms that happen. The Magna Carta was the big one that happened, you know, with the barons battling King William. Which King?
Yeah, I think Richard the First. No, it was William II. I think.
British education.
I know. Yeah, it's like not too much of a fan, but yes.
The Dutch East India Company, which is created in the the 16th century, that was the beginning of capitalism, really, and the sort of formation of stock markets, and there's just a massive explosion of growth. But the one I really think is important is when Deng Xiaoping recognized that Mao Zedong was a disaster for China, and he shifted towards a more capitalist model. The key thing that he did that just unlocked a massive boom was to transfer property rights to citizens to own their homes. And then they had something to work with, an ownership, a piece to build upon, right? So think about taking that concept. You said it, our economy is digital. Data is our economy. If we take property rights into that, the economic boom is almost unfathomably large that could come from this. So this is just a really important step. So what do you see coming out of it? Like what sort of business models will emerge out of this? Because I mean, if we overturn the Amazon model, what takes its place?
So I think my sort of vision, albeit a bit abstract, for the omega point where all of this gets to, is that we all become our own microeconomies. We all become nodes in this network, and we all have our micro networks within this network. And then within those networks, we all have our own currency. And then there's trading effectively between us as individuals and the collective, and the community can invest in us through our currencies, which are sort of like our tokens effectively, and they appreciate in value accordingly. And that's the economic potential of that is just spectacular. But even not just the economic potential of that, the social potential of that is spectacular. The innovation capability of that is spectacular. And I think, when I think about the economy of self in this regard, you are talking about several orders of magnitude of change in potential. And that's across the spectrum. I think, economically, but also in terms of innovation. So an example I use to try and illustrate this point, for me, the economy of self is really underpinned by this principle of clean data. And, the idea is if data is the oil of the 21st century, then we need a clean data system analogous to clean energy. And, so the contrary is therefore the dirty data economy. And that's the economy we have currently. And the problem with the dirty data economy is that economically, first of all, the machines always default to the lowest common denominator. This is a really important point because it's all based on averages. Why is it those references or referrals that Amazon gives you based on the phone conversation you had are just so out of touch with what you're actually seeking in life? Because it's always kind of going to defer to these lowest common denominators. Whereas if you push the intelligence to the edge, you bring the outliers, and we're seeing this in AI currently, that it's actually the differences, the people who are outside the system who have the most valuable data sets. So a simple example of this would be, if I said that I was developing an AI or a service, and this service was basically needed to use facial recognition, and therefore I needed to amass a lot of information about whether people simply were friends of yours or colleagues of yours. So if you imagine that through the current systems and you were kind of going to say, okay, I'm going to surveil the population to figure out who are your friends versus who are your colleagues. So where would you start? Well, you might say, okay, well, if the pictures are on Facebook, they're possibly friends. If they're on LinkedIn, they're possibly colleagues. But you're not really sure because some people use both for both, right? So then you might say, okay, well, let me see. Let me check your diary. Have you had a meeting with that person? And did you have a meeting with that person during office hours or in the evening? And then, well, that would only give you so much information. So you see, you have to get increasingly invasive into your life, into your data to try and understand that. So compare that data set now with a data set where you say, okay, I'm going to pay you $1 for every one of these 10,000 people that you identify who's a friend versus who's a colleague. So now you've converted a person into a knowledge worker, but you've generated a much more powerful and rich data set. And this is where that's the real secret in all of this, that it's the richness of the data. It's the quality of the data. Just like with oil, right? You know, not oil is of the same grade. That's why Saudi oil is so valuable, right? So it's really about who gets the highest quality data. That's where the innovation will move. That's where the AI systems will move. And that's where the innovation will be led from.
Picking up a little bit on the example you gave, I immediately thought, though, like, okay, so all those other friends now are going to want to have some buy-in to this process, I would think, because they'll essentially be also maybe against their will, if this other person is basically selling that information about them, identified as friends not only of this person but of everybody else, right? So there are ways to sort of create some of these problems, but I would imagine that you know, one way around that is to think of all these new forms of collective action, like DAOs, right? Decentralized autonomous organizations, and so one could imagine sort of data collectives being emerging, and that these things would become representative bodies by which we aggregate our data together, and that's what makes it valuable. It is the collective information of all of those groups together that, you know, people say your data in of itself, to your point about PII, it's meaningless. It's only valuable to the extent to which it is part of this broader aggregate of everything else that's going on. Well, tell us about metaMe then, and specifically metaKnights, and you know what you're doing within this realm, and how you're building upon it.
Absolutely. So metaMe essentially is a technology platform that is building a system to enable all of these rights. We're creating a new type of crypto asset fundamentally underpinning all of this, where we create a new kind of NFT that allows us to turn information into a real property. So we've been working on policy, regulation, and you know, our organization is basically split into an NGO that campaigns for digital human rights and works on policy, technology platform, which is metaMe, which then builds an interface to the tech system at whole, put it in simple terms. And then, but what we learned is that all of these things are kind of pointless, because what really is going to drive change is putting this information to people in a way that they can understand, not only intellectually, but emotionally. And for us, that's really about Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, particularly because they're the ones who are going to really fix this thing. Yeah. So we basically created a media company where we created a story, a science fiction story, to communicate this. And that's what metaKnights effectively is. And you know, I think everyone who was here the other night heard me talk about, sorry, I've got to put something up. Maybe you can help me with this, Irene. But
Sorry, on the laptop. Yeah.
I don't know which button I'm supposed to press. One of these. Maybe you guys can do it there. But essentially,
On the screen, but yeah, okay.
I'll give it to you. Yeah, essentially, we say think the Matrix meets Mr. Robot on the road to Wakanda. And it's basically it's an entertaining story to engage with Gen Zs particularly and teach them about this space. So we're really trying to drive awareness and change through storytelling, play, and then giving people tools of ownership. You know, NFTs, wallets, and the like, teaching people how to use wallets and the like. And it's kind of it's going really well. We did a Reg CF campaign on Start Engine. We raised over $1 million, which was the highest amount you could raise at the time, with the largest community. And I think that's the real key thing here, because it's really about the magic C in crypto is community, and it's really about this interaction of selves, really around common ideas. So that's been a real driver of it. And I, you know, to a point we were discussing over lunch, I think, you know, you're right about this fractional ownership and the like, but we're seeing that in NFTs already, where NFTs are really giving us a really great basis. They're surfacing these problems of IP, right? IP ownership and IP rights. Because ultimately, if you think about personal information, personal media as personal IP, then you can then start to distribute rights of that in really novel ways. And we're seeing that already happening at like big levels with things like Bored Ape Yacht Clubs, where they're just, you know, giving derivative rights to the collectors of that. That's a big thing that the NFT space is trying to deal with. So it's a model for how we distribute rights or profit or value from IP.
Right.
So, and then also and as I say, the NFT as a means to give access to services on an ongoing basis to build a relationship with your community is really key. So yeah, metaKnights, it's really kind of, I get that most people here aren't comic readers or video game players, but certainly I assure you, your kids or your nephews and nieces are going to go crazy about all of this stuff.
So we've now got up there this is one of the NFTs.
Yeah, so we created a special, this is one of our night cards. We have trading cards, and we created a special one for Link to for this event. We are actually today opening the release of our pre-sale of our first kind of non-pilot episode of our comic. So as an example of how NFTs can give you special benefits, so we have all of our Start Engine investors and all of the collectors of our NFTs. We give them access to our content a week in advance of the general public. So by owning one of our NFTs, you get access to our content early. You'll get access to educational facilities, training facilities, club facilities. There's a whole raft of stuff coming. We've got some really exciting stuff happening on the media front where we can't, I mean, it's still early. I'm not able to talk about it publicly. But let's just say in the film and feature film space, we're going to be making a really game-changing announcement about that. You know, our goal within the Internet Foundation is to work with other organizations to get 1 billion people self-sovereign by 2030. So we're really looking about how do we use this technology to have really scaled impact. And we think film and getting into culture, that's what I think is the real key thing.
One of the important things is like what the Web 2.0 world did was create a bunch of habits.
Yes.
Right? We had this habitual, we all know it, right? We pull up our phones and we're scrolling through Twitter and Facebook, and we're kind of addicts in a way, right? Habits. What I love about what you're doing is combining the publication, the art, the culture, with this experiential and educational element to it, so that, you know, everyone else says about crypto, by the way, is the only real way to earn crypto is to get some Bitcoin, transfer it to somebody, open a MetaMask account, do all these things. That's how you learn. It's by doing. So I think, like, you know, projects that are deliberately focused on that educational experiential component, but have an incentive to do so, because there's that, you know, NFT incentive aspect to it, can be a really powerful feedback loop to how we actually shift the whole model of how this whole thing works. Corinne, shall we take questions or what's the?
Yes, actually, thank you so much. That was great. You know, we could go on and on and on and on, and I don't think I'd get tired because that's such an interesting delve into this whole sovereign identity and economy itself. I mean, I could go on for another couple of hours, but I don't know. I'm going to take a poll here before I ask questions. I mean, I know the sugars and coffee from lunch has sort of deplete you a little bit. There might be a need for you to walk around a little bit. I do want to caution you though that it is a tight schedule, and for us to get back to the hotel and then get back to Lisbon, it's going to be a quick turnaround. So I'm asking everyone that we compress a little bit so that we can get back on track in terms of timing. Not anyone's fault, but we run Portuguese time every so often. Sometimes California time. But if there are a couple of questions that are burning, maybe a burning need to ask, do ask them, raise your hand, and we'll answer those briefly, and then we can move on to the next panel, which is, or do we want a coffee break? No coffee break. Okay, cool. Question, microphone, questions? I need the microphone. Over where? Here.
Great conversation, very philosophical. And I just wonder, how do you take on the giants like Facebook and Amazon? I mean, everything you said makes a lot of sense. I just don't know how you take on these two giants.
It's a great question. And you know, I've been doing this in this data space for almost a decade and a half now. And that was more my mindset in the past. Now I don't really feel the need to. I mean, you know, we used to call ourselves the Meta Group, and then, you know, some big social media company out there decided that Meta was a really good name and that they'd follow suit, right? So I think the future is on our side. We're part of a mega trend that is happening anyway. I'm less concerned with taking on Facebook and Google. I'm more concerned with building the future, because I think if we build the future, the world is coming towards it anyhow. So, and that disruption always starts at the edges. It never starts in the mainstream. It always starts in a fringe space that's never really articulated.
Yeah, exactly. I think one way to think about it is like what we tend to think of in terms of disruption or innovation is go, okay, how do I create a different version of that, right? So what everyone was saying for quite a while, we need to create a decentralized social media platform that we all collectively own, right? How are you going to migrate? No one's going to want to migrate because they're already on this thing. What you do is you create other spaces where creators, which means us, by the way, we are the creators, right? Exactly. We come together and we start creating something. We still have Facebook, right? But we build everything else, which is, I mean, I was at NFT LA and I think you were there, Lou, weren't you, right? I mean, I was so struck by the energy of the creators and these coming out, like you're seeing creators now saying, I don't need to talk to the film studio anymore. I don't talk to the record label. I can sell NFTs and build and I'll collaborate with you and we'll build something on our own. So the film studios are still there, right? But there's this whole other activity that's going on. So yeah, I think watch what's happening around rather than what's happening to Meta and Face Meta or Book Meta or whatever the name is. You know?
Thank you. So I want to start. So let's talk about that. Like we said, let there be change. We asked you to be the change when we started this conversation, and there it is. Build the future. Be the change. Build the future. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say, just last thing, on these, they will be available till Friday. There's only 186 of them. It's very limited. It's only for this conference, only for this audience. Fridays, 6 o'clock local time, it shuts down. So if you want to get one, make sure you get it before then. And like I say, I think your kids will be the ones, if not for those older among the group here.
And I know some of you have challenges knowing how to use a wallet and all that sort of stuff. That's some of the challenges that you have. Ray will help you out. And if you don't buy it at 5:30, I'm going in, I'm buying the rest of it, and then my children will have generation wealth. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you.